Hello everyone, my name is Sandra Ideskär and I work with International Business Development at the Swedish Energy Agency, and I wish you all a very warm welcome to this event at Sweden Innovation Days. The project that we will be discussing and having an event about today is a project that the Swedish Energy Agency and the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment at Oxford University embarked on approximately a year ago. We will be looking at an actor that's often undervalued in the climate transition, Ministries of Finance. And the origins of this project is the Swedish Energy Agency's program Net Zero Compatible Initiative, where we look at how we can expand the innovation agenda. And who you will be listening to today is Cameron Hefford, Oxford professor and the director of Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment. I hope you all enjoy this event, and if you want to read the report, you can read it at the Smith School website. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy.
Hello everyone, my name is Cameron Hepburn. I'm Professor of Environmental Economics at Oxford University and Director of the Smith School of Enterprise and Environment. Thanks very much for having me with you today and for letting me beam in from the UK. I'd rather be with you guys in person, but at least this way it reduces emissions. I'm here to share some results of a piece of work that we've done jointly with the Swedish Energy Agency on the role of Ministries of Finance around the world in driving and shaping the low carbon energy transition. Before I do that, just tell you a little bit about the Smith School. We've been around for nearly 15 years now, doing work on stranded assets, the legal attribution of climate change, water security, work on net zero investing and finance, and also on the COVID recovery. We have about 100 academics working on different areas of enterprise and the environment, climate, water, and energy issues. Now, this report, it's a really exciting piece of work that's a privilege to be involved with. We launched it recently, just a couple of months ago in January, at the Science Museum in London with many of our authors and steering group members. You can see their panel discussion chaired by Polita Clark from the Financial Times, with representatives from the OECD, from Chatham House, from a couple of political parties, Nobel Laureate Joe Stiglitz, Mariana Mazzucato, who's a big thinker on this area too, and it was a super event. The report was produced by a strong team of professors from the USA and Europe, and it's a privilege to be able to be part of that team and to share with you the results of it, of the report with you today. So I want to do three things. Firstly, set out the situation that we're in, the challenges that Ministries of Finance face. Secondly, have a look at some of the solutions for the world ahead, which is going to look rather different, unfortunately, from the world we are leaving behind us. And then take you through the top 10 policy recommendations from the research. Okay, so where are we? Well, if you're sitting in a Ministry of Finance, it's, well, probably exciting would be a nice way of putting it. But we're going from crisis to crisis at the moment. And arguably, this isn't some sort of abnormal, uncomfortable, unusual moment. We're actually moving into what some commentators are calling a state of permacrisis. So if we have a look at where we are, we've got these symptoms: high inflation, possible recession, high energy prices. Okay, they've been coming down, but this is they're not where we would ideally have them be. We have war on our doorstep. We've had pandemics, obviously the big COVID-19 pandemic, but all the science suggests that actually, unfortunately, these sorts of pandemics are becoming more likely rather than less likely. And of course, underlying this is a kind of deglobalization, geopolitical tension that is happening, along with the climate challenges and the biodiversity challenges. Now, these different elements of crisis all have financial implications, all have implications for comparative advantage of nations, for fiscal positions. And Ministries of Finance are effectively having to deal with these issues. They might not think of them as core business. They might think of them as some kind of exogenous shock coming in from the side. But actually, I would argue, for better or worse, these are now core issues, and a better prepared Finance Ministry will be on top of these issues. And if you ask what are the root causes of these various acute and chronic crises, I think we have depreciation of some of our capital stock. To speak like an economist, I make no apologies for that. While we've been busy building up our physical capital, our produced capital, and our financial assets, we have been depreciating our social capital, the trust between people and between nations, our ability to do deals with one another, and also our natural capital, the very life support system of humans and non-human species on Earth. I think these are the fundamental issues. And again, they are within the remit of a Ministry of Finance. And in the UK, the Chancellor of the Exchequer within Her Majesty's Treasury has just commissioned, a couple of years ago, I was on the advisory board, the Dasgupta review of the economics of biodiversity. So it's no surprise that a major country's treasury is now thinking about the economics and the finance of biodiversity protection. So to put that into a little bit more detail, but I won't labor the point, clearly our economies are fragile. It's not just prices that have been rising, continue to rise, it's temperatures as well. And we're seeing trust and trade on the decline. We're in a context where climate impacts around the world are growing, whether it's floods in Pakistan, fires in Asia or California, smoke, collapse of glaciers, killing people, German floods, extreme summers in various places, Australia, my home country, with many fires and so on, food supply threats, etc. Okay, so not exactly a great start to a talk, how to win over your audience, especially when you're talking from afar. My apologies for that. But I want to talk about energy. And in particular, that context, you are hearing people say, well, hang on, this transition to net zero, I'm not sure about it. How much is it going to cost? It feels very expensive. We don't have the money for it. We've got to deal with the war. We've got to deal with the pandemic. We've got to deal with all these other things. Yeah, maybe it can wait. Maybe it can. Maybe it can't. But the traditional view here, in fact, if I was in the room with you now, I would poll you. What do you think the transition to net zero will cost as a fraction of GDP for your energy sector? And if I polled you, I'd probably give you some choices, 5 to 10%, 2 to 5%, 0 to 2%, or negative. And most of you'd probably be, in the 2 to 5% range, I guess. Maybe 0 to 2% range. Maybe some in the 5 to 10% range. But I'm guessing that very few or none of you would be in the negative range. Well, I'm going to suggest to you today that actually the cost is in the negative range. And there is a huge amount to gain from recognizing that. And there's a lot of, deal space effectively for finance ministries once you do recognize that. So let me move on to the solutions, new thinking for an unstable world. And let me start with some justification of that fairly bold claim that the costs might be negative. So the justification's in the data. If you look back over several decades here from 1980 on the left panel, and you look at the levelized cost of electricity generated from, say, in this case, solar photovoltaic, solar PV, those little black dots are the solar costs. They've been coming down. You know that, I know that. They've been coming down fast. That's an exponential fall there. It looks like a straight line, but it's a log plot. So every big unit there on the vertical axis is a factor of 10 decline. And if you look at the projections, whether they're from integrated assessment models, IAMs, or whether from the Energy Agency or other organization, the projections are wrong. And they're not just a bit wrong. The way I've drawn this chart shows them looking a bit wrong. But use your brains, concentrate. A jump of one of those big units is a factor of 10. So these forecasts are often out by a factor of 10. That's a pretty bad forecast. I mean, okay, they're scenarios, but the scenario is way off the reality. Now, if you have a look at the right panel, it's the same set of observed solar photovoltaic cost declines in the gray dots and the black line. And the horizontal green lines are floor costs, i.e. the lowest cost that various modelers have assumed that solar could reach. It would never get below those floor costs. And if you have a look at the black line compared to the green lines, the so-called floors aren't doing very well. We're breaking through the minimum ever possible cost of solar year after year. And those who are betting against solar have been losing. And arguably, those losses are going to continue, probably after a little blip in the coming years, where we deal with some supply chain disruptions and a bit of deglobalization. But the underlying technological trends, there's no reason why they don't continue. So why is it a losing bet? Well, it's because of innovation in the energy sector. And this is not just in people in labs in thinking about solar, whether in Australia or the States or China or whatever. It's in the manufacturing process, it's in the install process, it's in the inverters, it's also in wind, it's also in batteries, in electrolysis, in other forms of storage. So there's a whole ecosystem of innovation here, which is driving down the costs of clean energy. So what, you might think? And clean energy is a small fraction of the whole. Okay, it's got to get bigger, but we're still fundamentally reliant on fossil fuels. And right now, yes, that's true. We are fundamentally reliant on fossil fuels right now. But what we have done in work, research in the last couple of years at Oxford, and which is included in this report with the Swedish Energy Agency, is taken these technological trends and said, what if, rather than assuming that they suddenly stop, which is what most of the models traditionally assume, what if we forecast them based on the data? We work through, we generate our predictions, we work out how wrong they are, we get some error bars, we work out our confidence intervals, and we forecast what a clean energy system and a fast transition would look like compared to business as usual. And what we find out is that a fast transition would actually be cheaper, i.e. the costs are negative, and they're not just a bit negative, they're very negative. They are $12 trillion worth of savings compared to business as usual from going quickly rather than from going slowly. Okay, why? Well, that's what I'd be asking if I were you. Why is it so much cheaper to go faster? And two reasons. The first is that the learning that happens is partly a function of the deployment of these technologies. The faster we deploy them, the faster we learn, and the faster costs fall, and the faster we get to a cheaper clean energy economy. Now, of course, there are limits on that. You can't, tomorrow change the entire system from fossil fuels to renewables. But the point is, within reasonable bounds, going faster and pretty much going as fast as we can is cheaper than going slower because of the learning. But there's another reason. Going faster means that we don't invest our hard-earned cash and capital in assets that we're then going to have to scrap earlier. The slower we go, the more stranded assets we have later. And the faster we get to a cheaper set of energy inputs, the faster we get to an economy that is more productive. As we all know, many of the key moments in economic history happen because of innovations in energy that reduce the factor input costs to the economy, enabling much greater economic activity, more surplus, more tax receipts for those of you in finance ministries, and greater prosperity and productivity. And we're on the cusp of another one of these revolutions in the energy sector, and hence a big spur to economic prosperity. Now, let me just be really clear about this and put this research into some more numbers about the energy system for you. So, left-hand panel, similar to what you've just seen. So, actual costs in black, predicted costs in colorful lines there that are very wrong. Using those predicted costs, what sort of energy mix do you get in 2040? Well, you get an increase in the blue clean electricity here, but it's not a radical increase. Emissions fall, which is good. That's the dashed yellow line, but you're not exactly radically reshaping the economy. That's based on the dodgy predictions that have been wrong by a factor of 10. So what if, this is a kind of revolutionary idea. What if we made some predictions based on the data? Call me an Oxford professor or something. So if we do that, and you can see the left-hand panel forecast based on the data, and you put them into a similar global final energy model, and you've got a pretty massive shift in the energy system by 2040. So that's within less than 20 years from now. Now, there are various reasons why that's going to be hard to achieve in practice, but what this is telling you is that this is the least cost, the best mix, cheapest mix for the global economy. It's not just electricity, it's energy. So it's the whole lot. So it includes the cost of electrolysis, of hydrogen, of storage, of grid connections, etc. So to the extent that we can do this, get over the politics and the NIMBYism and the rest of it, we clearly should. Right, now the kind of good news to compare and contrast with all the bad news that I started with doesn't end with cheaper energy. If you think about this transition to net zero, some work by our friends at McKinsey shows that you're looking at around $13 trillion per annum of revenues up for grabs in the global economy. I'm not saying Sweden per se, or any given country, Ghana, Australia, the UK, Chile could capture any of these, but the point is that the economy is transitioning, indeed transforming, being rewired by this transition, and Ministries of Finance have a key role in understanding that shift in economic comparative advantage so that they can position their economies for the sorts of objectives that a Ministry of Finance has, which we'll go into in a moment. And a key to doing that properly is understanding that different technologies require different sorts of policy, financial support, or taxation in some cases at different stages. So some technologies are still in this emerging stage in some countries, others are already scaling, and we're getting to the point now with many of the energy technologies where we're on the upswing of those exponential S curves, and we're heading into system reconfiguration territory. By the way, with exponential growth processes, something that people don't understand, most humans don't kind of instinctively get. I use my mother as a test case. She's a wonderful woman. She doesn't instinctively get this. When you've got exponential growth from a low base, at the start, everybody says nothing's happening. It's slower than expected. We've been waiting forever, nothing's happening. And because 50%, say, growth rate on 0.001, still in absolute terms gives you very small incremental growth. But by that time you hit that, the upswing of the S curve, if you're on 10% of the economy and you're still growing at 50%, it's not very long, you can do the math, before you're the entire economy and the technology is totally taken over. So at some point, everybody says, oh my goodness, it's happening way faster than I expected. So it happens slower than you expect initially, and then faster than you expect. Whether this is mobile phone diffusion or actually COVID-19 diffusion, these are processes with exponential growth, and they take us by surprise all the time because they're slow and then they're fast. Okay, so the role of Ministries of Finance specifically. If you think about what the objectives are of a finance ministry, you want a stable and fair fiscal regime, you want a balanced budget, you want a competitive country, and you want well-managed national assets. And then you have a think on the vertical side here on the left in the risks and opportunities created by this transition to cleaner energy. You've got the collapse of the energy trilemma, which is to say, this trade-off between clean, cheap, and secure is rapidly no longer a trade-off. We're already at the point where clean and cheap go together. And if anything, the last couple of years have taught us that it's not exactly necessarily the case that fossil energy is super secure either. So you can go down that list. I don't have time, I guess, to run through them in detail, but where the comparative advantage is going to be, where jobs are, how you can reform the fiscal regime to have better looking public balance sheets in due course, and look through the risks, climate damages, competitiveness issues. Maybe when you're transitioning, you mismanage public funds. It's always a risk. I mean, government failure is ever present. Dare I say, perhaps unkindly, particularly in the UK right now, but we will see. I wish I was there with you to hear the muted chuckles. Hopefully, because you're polite Swedes, you probably didn't even laugh at all. But I'll never know. and the write down of stranded assets and so on. So there's a bunch of these objectives, and there's a set of areas where these objectives map onto the risks and opportunities of the energy transition. So let me move towards wrapping up by taking you through our top 10 policy recommendations for Ministries of Finance as we think about this transition to a cheaper, cleaner, and more secure energy system driven by the innovations that we are seeing today. So top 10 recommendations in kind of two themes here. So our first theme is using Ministry of Finance policies, interventions, decisions to redirect capital, to reallocate capital towards more efficient, more productive parts of the energy system and the economy more widely. So how do we do that? One, raise domestic R&D budgets for the clean energy innovation sector. It may seem like a no-brainer, given what I've just said, that we should be seeking to capture these innovations, the competitive advantage for your nations and your nation. And you can see that this is starting to become obvious, I think, across the world as the Americans race for advantage with the Inflation Reduction Act, and the Chinese have been at this for at least half a dozen years, if not longer, and Europe is in on the game too. Nonetheless, we're still at a situation where, as a percentage of GDP, you might expect, given that humanity's civilization prosperity depends upon us being successful in this innovation challenge, you might expect we're devoting a reasonable chunk of GDP to the issue. Those of you in the audience probably know how much we devote to our R&D and energy, and certainly on the public side, it's very large. It's less than 0.1% of GDP. So a bit more there. Number two, we have a whole range of public investment institutions, different national banks, multinational development banks, and other institutions that can provide capital and support across these phases of emergence, scaling, and reconfiguration. And then there's, in many economies, the government is a big chunk of the national economy. Sometimes it's up to 50% or getting up there. And so what the government spends its money on matters. And using green public procurement can really create new markets for these new technologies and help scale the ideas, the tech, and the behaviors, the businesses in spaces that are going to go on and become globally dominant. In terms of number four, balancing our budgets. Well, I'm often asked by finance ministries, what are we going to do about fossil fuels? You know, we get quite a lot of our tax from fossil fuels, and when they go out of business, it doesn't look good. And this is a very easy question to answer. So one, we also do a lot of subsidizing of fossil fuels, and the numbers are there in the report. You're talking hundreds of billions in both directions, taxes and subsidies. So the subsidies can fall. And on the tax side, there's a worry that, well, what are we going to tax in the energy sector when our fossil fuels fall away? I just don't think it's an issue for the following reason. The economists in the audience will understand the idea that your tax wedge is the difference between your consumer price and your producer price. The tax is the bit in the middle. So if the cost of energy is falling, the producer price is falling, which it will do, even if the consumer price falls a bit or stays the same, you've got a greater potential tax wedge. So I'm not saying, hey, Ministries of Finance, go out and tax the hell out of solar and EVs now. That would kill the golden goose. Let the golden goose grow and lay some eggs, and then you can take the eggs, right? But there is a phased transition of taxing fossil to taxing energy. And of course, there's questions about how much you want to tax goods rather than bads anyway in an economy, but the economists amongst you will recognize the idea of Ramsey taxation, relatively inelastic factors. So we may, sorry for the nerdy bit there, but you may want to tax a bit of energy. I think I'm about to run out of time. So the remaining recommendations, crowding in private investment by creating clarity and confidence about the direction of the transition. thinking through the equity issues around job creation, industry creation. Where are those jobs? Which deciles, income deciles of the economy are they to be found? And then in the second big theme, the ways of working, a bit more fundamental here. We need to rethink how we analyze our policies. We have been doing work here in the UK and many other countries around the world on thinking through cost-benefit analysis, which is really good for marginal policies, but this is a system transformation. Different methods of analysis are required, and the Treasury in the UK has been getting on top of this recently. I know the Americans are thinking about it too. We need to be thinking in terms of missions. Now, there is always a risk if your government is getting highly interventionist in an economy that you've got government failure, you're wasting public money. I'm acutely aware of that. But equally, if the government can set clarity over the direction of travel and front up some funding that then the private sector can pile in on top of, as we're seeing with the Inflation Reduction Act, you can get much greater returns for everybody, including for the private sector. And then, of course, this is a global problem, and working together, increasing trust, increasing coordination and collaboration within countries and between countries is really important. So that's it for the top 10 recommendations. I've gone a bit over time, my apologies. I'd really like to thank Sandra and Paul from the Swedish Energy Agency, who are key in us pulling this work together and getting all the pieces into place. And look, I hope you have a wonderful couple of days there in Sweden. And I'm sorry again that I'm not with you in person, but thank you for allowing me participate remotely. And hopefully I can join you again in another year. Thanks very much. Bye.